Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to the sheep pen, bah, where no goats are allowed. So today I want to talk about when Jesus started an insurrection. Don't. I'm sorry, a little humor in there. But this is a story of Jesus engaging in what we would call civil disobedience. In this story, if it happened today, Jesus would have been charged with trespassing, assault and battery, animal cruelty, and probably disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. So he definitely would have been cuffed and stuffed if this happened in modern society. And those of you who want to explain this away, I'm sorry, you're just kind of hung up on your own doctrine and you're unable to read this for what it is actually saying. And you want to read more into it than is actually here. And you want to make it so it's not that Jesus didn't commit a crime. But he most definitely committed property crime, assault, and battery, and even animal cruelty. And when I get to the end of this, you'll see that. But it was for a purpose, and it's an example of righteous indignation. It is, to some degree, a license for us to engage in civil disobedience if it's for a righteous cause. And let's get to the bottom of this, because many people will tell you that the reason he overturned the money changers' tables, the reason that he basically caused this scene in the temple, was because the people there were conning the people of God. They were ripping people off. They were engaged in shady business activities. But I would take that a step further and say that this is a total condemnation by Jesus of the entire temple system. And I hope to prove that to you in this video. Before we get further into the video, though, and start with the scriptures, I would like to give you a quick update. We did pass out 15 lunches to the needy in a tornado disaster zone this week in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And thanks to you, the few people that have helped, a few people have helped. And we've received $250 more since then, and we're going to do this again. But we did make those gift bags that you can see in previous videos here on the channel, and I passed them out. I did not video that interaction, and I'm going to make a video talking about this more in detail, but I just wanted to give you an update that we're out being sheep, not being goats. We're out fulfilling Matthew 25, and we fed some people, and in doing so, we fed Jesus. So thank you all for the donations that for the Give It Away program, and we're going to continue to give it away and fulfill our obligations according to Matthew 25. Now, let's get started in the story of Jesus in the temple. So this is in all three of the synoptic gospels and in the book of John. It's one of the few things that is in every single book in the gospels. And I think it's very much undertaught and misunderstood. So we're going to look at each of these four passages. Let's start in Matthew 21, verse 12. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. So this goes on to talk about a discussion that Jesus has with them. And once again, in true Jesus fashion, he tends to befuddle them and beat them basically through this discourse. And that's all fine and good, and that's a study in its own, and I mainly want to look at what he did and what really made them mad. Because it wasn't even the act of civil disobedience that made him mad. Jesus was not arrested on the spot, when if anybody else had tried something like that, they would have been immediately seized upon. But they didn't mess with Jesus because he had such a huge following, and they were clearly afraid of the afraid of the mob, afraid of the riot that might occur if they laid hands on him. And not only did he do this thing, he continued to hang around the temple and minister to people and build this crowd of followers. And this, more than anything else, is what put a target on Jesus's back. If you want to know the truth, it was when he came after their money, when he came to their temple and disrupted it, when he stood up to Judaism, stuck his fist at it, and said, "You guys are unrighteous and you're doing it wrong." Okay? And I'm going to prove that to you, that this wasn't about these dishonest businessmen conducting business in the church, but it was about all of this commerce and how this was a system that took advantage of the people and offered them nothing in return. So let's jump on to Mark. So we started in Matthew. Now we're going to Mark. And each one of these scriptures is going to give you a little bit more information and another angle at this whole story. And if you take each one and just teach on that, it's easy to miss the point. This is one of those where it takes all four of these gospels to give you a big picture of what's going on. So over in Mark, this is going to be found in chapter 11, is the same story. Now the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry. Jesus was hungry. And seeing from afar off a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. But in response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." So he curses this fig tree. And his disciples heard it. Okay? So that's all there is to it. He just pronounces this curse over this fig tree because it didn't have any fruit on it. This goes into this whole discussion of fruit and ministry. If you're doing ministry, if you're representing God, you have to have fruit. I just talked about the fruit of this ministry. We went out and fed 15 people lunch and gave away a case of water, and into a disaster area, helping people who had already slipped through the cracks. See, if there's no fruit, if you're not giving a benefit to the people of God, then it's not ministry. You're taking advantage of them. It's all about the fruit. If I ever get, and I sometimes do get attacked by traditional ministers with stick and mortar churches who want to question my qualifications, I go right back to them and go, "Show me your fruit. How many people have you led to Jesus? How many people have been healed in your ministry? How many people have you stopped from being homeless and helped off the street? How many people have you fed? How many people have you ministered to in prison? There's no fruit in your ministry. Don't condemn me when you have no fruit," right? So when Jesus sees this tree, it's a lesson to his disciples, and he's setting the stage for what he's about to do. Because as soon as he curses this fig tree, it goes right on to this. So they came to Jerusalem. Then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teachings. When evening had come, he went out of the city. Now in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from its root. And Peter remembered, saying to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." So this is a prophetic act. This isn't just an act of civil disobedience. This isn't just a protest. It was a prophetic act. He walked in to Jerusalem. He showed his disciples what he was about to do by cursing the fig tree. He went in to the temple, and he didn't just disrupt, right? He committed acts of violence. And I saw one Christian minister try to say that he only whipped the animals, not the humans. So therefore, Jesus didn't commit assault. And I call you I won't call you a liar. I will say you're misleading the people. Because as we hit all four of the accounts of this, you will find as we get closer to the end that there is in no way an indication that his violence was only towards animals. It was towards the people. How do you think he drove them out? Did he just go up and Karen them? No. He grabbed their tables, flipped them over. He came at them. He didn't just get in their face. You'll see before this is over that he actually came armed with the perfect weapon to drive them out. It was premeditated. It was a plan. And it was a statement against not just this criminal behavior of ripping people off in this money changer scheme, which I'll get into later on in this message, but it was a condemnation of the entire system. He cursed the whole fig tree. He cursed the whole system. And he stated that in his actions, in this prophetic act, that this religious system was not producing fruit and would be cursed and would never again really rise to the position that it once was and the control that it once had. And we'll get into what this means in the next scriptures. So we left off in Mark. Now we're going to go to Luke. Matthew, Mark, Luke. So I'm going to start a little bit before this because I guess at some point here he curses the fig tree, but before he comes into Jerusalem, as they're approaching the city on the morning of this event, it says, and this is Luke chapter 19 and verse 41 is where we're going to start. And it says, now as he drew near, he saw the city, Jerusalem, and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you, and your children within you, to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon the other, because you did not know the time of your visitation. So this is another prophetic statement. That there are many prophetic statements about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the condemnation of the entire temple system. Shame on you, Old Testament scholars who want to drag us back into something that Jesus condemned. He condemned the whole concept, the entire system, and the city that contained it. And this prophetic word was actually a prophecy that was fulfilled. Many of you do not know the fate of Jerusalem, that some 37 years after this statement by Jesus, well after his crucifixion, that the city of Jerusalem would be sacked by the Emperor Titus in 70 AD. The Roman emperor surrounded the city of Jerusalem in a siege that lasted for years. It got so bad that some argue that every evil thing, every tribulation you've ever heard of in the book of Revelation was fulfilled during that siege, because it is history tells us that people ate their own children out of starvation, that they ate all the animals, they even boiled shoe leather and to make a broth to try to sustain themselves, that the siege that they surrounded, they created an embankment around the city of Jerusalem and starved them out until they destroyed the temple. The Romans came in, destroyed the temple, and just like Jesus said, there wasn't one stone left on top of the other when they were done with it. And he prophesied that right before going into the temple and condemning the temple system, not just the money changers. So we start back up at 45. He just finished with this prophecy that would be fulfilled at 70 AD when the Romans sacked Jerusalem. And he says, then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, it is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And he was teaching daily in the temple. But the chief priests, so he hung out not just for that day, but for days. He hung out for days preaching in the temple. And he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to hear him. So this is about, once again, the fact that he was able to do this because he came with the crowd. You can see why this could be construed as an insurrection, right? By today's standards, this would be an insurrection that Jesus was ahead of. And they didn't want to tackle this situation on the spot because they were outnumbered by his followers and the people that were there in his defense. So we're going to move on. Well, I do want to talk briefly about this next conversation because they couldn't do anything to Jesus. But if you look here, starting in chapter 20 of Luke, now it happened on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, that the chief priests and scribes together with the elders confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority?" But he answered and said to them, "I also will ask you one thing." He always answered a question with another question. So in true Jesus fashion, he says, "I also will ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men?" Now he's talking about John the Baptist. "And they reasoned among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it was from. You see the fear that they would be stoned to death if they said something against John the Baptist. That this is a very different image than the one where Jesus is just condemning some people for taking advantage of other people financially. That this is much bigger than this. This is a condemnation of the system. He is acting in civil disobedience. This is protest. And he's defying them. And a lot of people want to ascribe as to why Jesus was crucified. What was the motivation? And I tell you, the motivation is clear in all four Gospels. It's when he went after their money. It's when he condemned them as being fruitless. It's when he prophesied the destruction of the temple and said, this temple will be destroyed, right? That's what set them on the task of destroying Jesus. And they would have got him quicker if it wasn't for the fact that he was always surrounded by this mass of followers. All right, so now we're going to hop just a few pages over to the Gospel according to John. And this is going to be John 2, chapter 2, starting in verse 13. "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand." I find it interesting that John doesn't say the Passover. He doesn't say the Passover of God. He recognizes this as clearly a Jewish event. "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business." Then you see his premeditation. People who just use the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke will say this was a crime of passion, that Jesus was filled with righteous indignation, and in that moment he just snapped. And they'll even use it to teach you anger management and teach you how everybody has problems with anger issues. It's how you deal with them that matters, right? And miss completely that this was a planned insurrection against a unrighteous church and its control over the people. And it's the milking of the people and the wealth that they were hoarding for themselves. All of the splendor and pomp and circumstances surrounding this system, and the people were starving while the holy men wore fancy robes and lived in mansions and had servants and lived a life of luxury, right? This is a condemnation of that. The Pharisee has risen again in the form earlier, hundreds of years ago, in the Catholic Church, and now once again in modern evangelical churches where money is worshipped and great riches are spent, and people have private jets because they don't want to ride in the tube full of demons. Kenneth Copeland, do you know who you are? Right? That these people are raising money for another Learjet while people starve. In some ways, this modern system is even more corrupt. You can see why I preach against the church. You can see why I kind of sound like a voice crying in the wilderness. You can see why they hate me just as much as they hated Jesus. And if you do what Jesus did, they'll hate you too. That's what corrupt people do. Oh man, I got off on a tangent. Let's get back to this. So he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business, when he had made a whip of cords. So he saw it first, then he went away, and he found some ropes, some cords, and he tied them together into essentially a cat of nine tails and created a whip out of cords. Now, did he just tie knots in the cord to give it more sting? Was it just the loose rope? Or did he do like was the custom of the time and weave into the rope bits of metal and barbs or stone? We just know he made a weapon. Jesus went out, made a weapon appropriate for the task, and came back. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." And so then he says something very interesting. This is in John. It's not in the other Gospels. Then his disciples remembered that as it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." This is an Old Testament reference. This is something that they thought to themselves, not something Jesus acknowledged. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then John goes on in this post note that years later, sometime later, after Jesus was resurrected on the third day, that they said he must have been talking about his own physical body and not the destruction of the temple. But you can see he prophesied it in another one. He cried over the city as he looked down on it, saying that it would be sacked. He predicted it would, and rightfully and correctly predicted that the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed, and that included the temple. And then later on, you'll see later on in the Gospels, in another study, we can talk about how he literally said, again, there will not be one stone left on top of the other, that the temple would be destroyed. He prophesied it. He called for it. He told them, destroy this temple. Destroy this temple. It wasn't about the money changers. Yes, that was the worst part of it. And what did the money changers do, just so that we all understand? The Jewish temple required sacrifices. Also, you don't see Jesus in the Bible partaking in the sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Passover wasn't for sin, but for protection. And if you were a good Jew, you had to go on Passover and make your Passover sacrifice. And that's what this event was all about, that Jesus crashed. They would demand that you paid in a shekel. A shekel was a certain currency. But in that time in Israel, there were many currencies. There was raw silver, there were silver coins, there was Roman currency, and they would only accept one kind of currency. And why did they have to pay? Well, they had to buy a sacrifice. Most people didn't own sheep and goats, and if they did, they traveled from out in the country so far, they didn't want to deal with trying to wrangle an animal on that long journey, and they would just buy a sacrifice in the temple itself. Okay, so they were purchasing something that they were going to sacrifice. And so the money changers took advantage of that, because you couldn't pay for any of the animals except in shekels, and they would add a surcharge onto converting your currency or your raw silver or your goods into a shekel. And then you had to buy an animal, and there was another markup there that you were paying half again or even twice as much for these animals at the temple, like a convenience store prices, right? Like stadium prices, football game prices, right? For these required sacrifices. So Jesus attacks this system, but he attacks the entire temple. He gives you a prophetic word ahead of time that this fruitless tree is cursed to be destroyed. He tells them to tear the temple down. Then in another scripture, he talks about how that this whole city will be destroyed. And in 70 AD, it all happened. And it was the end of the temple system. It was the end of Jerusalem. And it wouldn't be a Jewish controlled center again until 1948, when the United States declared Israel a state for the Jews and started sending survivors of the Holocaust there. And then we know about all the wars that have resulted from that. So for nearly 2,000 years, this city was cursed. The temple was destroyed, just as Jesus said. He came to undo the entire system and give us a new gospel, a new reality, a new commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your mind, all your heart, all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. That if you love Jesus, if you love God, then you'll feed his people. You'll clothe people in need, even the most destitute, even the lowest of lows, even the worst of the worst. We're required to help. We're required to forgive our enemies. We're required to forgive our neighbor. We're required to love one another. He says, if you'll know that these are my disciples by the fruit they produce. You'll know by their love they have for one another. And to this day, that temple system starts creeping its ugly head up. The Catholic Church rose up to greatness with these grand cathedrals where everything was covered in gold plating. The books were made from gold leaf, literally melted gold laid on the pages, that these priests would put on clothes that cost so much money to make and of such fine material that a working man would have to work a whole year to pay for one. And that is not how we're supposed to live. You know, a lot of people know I have a pretty high IQ. I'm well across the line of genius. I play 12 instruments. I've had a very interesting life. And I will tell you this, that I kind of lost my train of thought there. That's good. Maybe I was falling into pride in that moment. But let's just say I figured some things out. And these grand cathedrals are all designed to build the wealth of the priest. And, you know, my name, Sage Wanderer, seems random. But if you decipher what it means, it literally means itinerant preacher. It means wandering sage. Jesus was a wandering sage. Jesus did not acquire wealth. He lived basically couch surfing. He lived on the donations of the people that supported him. And he did not build grand cathedrals. In fact, he attacked one. He tore it. He called for it to be tore down. He prophesied the end of it. If you study the lost years of Jesus, you'll find that he did this at every religion where excess is practiced. And the spirit of the Pharisee has risen up in this world, in these televangelists, TV preachers, these people with these huge churches with their $1,000 suits and their $600 haircuts and their $100,000 cars and their $1 million airplanes. And where is their fruit? Are they feeding the hungry? Are they healing the sick? Are they ministering to the brokenhearted? I would say they're just like the fig tree that Jesus cursed, and that these modern temples will be torn down too. Because in the end, God will not be mocked. He will not allow his servants to take over and become the landowners. He will not let them become the overseers. He will not let them become the government. He will always keep tearing down these systems. And that's part of my job here, is to show you that true ministry is that of the peasant. It's that of the man who asks for very little and gives much more back. And that's how preachers ought to be, and that's how I live my life in this ministry. And it is supported by you. I don't work a day job anymore. This ministry supports me. But you can look around and see that I don't have carpet on my floor. I live in a shed house conversion. I live down 4 miles of dirt road. I drive a 10-year-old Corolla, right? That just is almost an eyesore, right? Because I refuse to engage in the pursuit of wealth. I will not hold the people hostage. I will not demand from them a burden to support more than my basic needs Feed me, clothe me, help me keep a roof over my head, and that's all I ask of you. And for that, I will continue to bear fruit in this ministry. I will continue to feed the hungry. I will continue to clothe the naked with your help. We're doing it together. It's a project. It's a group endeavor. That's what a church ought to be. A group of people helping other people. If your church is not that, look for a different church. If your church is buying new pews while people in the church go hungry, you need to condemn them, walk out, and find another church. If they're preaching hell, sin, and the grave, and they're not teaching you that you should have fruit in your ministry, they're not teaching you that you should be a benefit to people, then you need to find a new church. I hope you enjoyed this message. I do ask for your financial care, and that's what it is. You're caring for me. I'm asking you to share your fruit with me so that I can be a blessing to others. You are a blessing so that you can be a blessing, and that money will go no further than my basic needs. My Walmart clothes, my old shack, my 10-year-old car. That's what I need help with, the basics, and that's all. And any money we raise beyond that will go to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and spread this gospel to the four corners of the earth through this crazy little machine. And my only overhead for this is a janky, broken cell phone that costs less than $100. I don't even have the fancy camera equipment. Had some, it broke. I hope you enjoyed this message. I hope you take this to heart and see that the corruption in the church is something that is always trying to be manifested. And it is up to us to stand in opposition of that. And I'll leave you with this powerful prayer. May God surround you in his ring of fire and hedge of thorns of protection. May he send mighty angels of sufficient rank and authority and number to defend you and drive the enemy from your midst. And then may he surround you in his blanket of peace, the peace of the Holy Ghost. May you be empowered with supernatural abilities and gifts. May you be a benefit and a blessing to others, and may you spread the light of the gospel to the world. We'll see you next time. Thank you for your support.